50 tons. Let that sink in for a second. 50 tons of raw Douglas fir, dangling 200 feet in the air, swinging across a canyon at speeds that would make your stomach drop. No helicopter, no crane. Just steel cables stretched a mile into the wilderness, groaning under impossible weight, and one man at the controls deciding whether today ends with timber on the landing or bodies in the brush. The Pacific Northwest, 1920. Douglas fir forests so dense you could walk for miles and never see sunlight hit the forest floor. Trees that were seedlings when Columbus sailed, 300 feet tall, 10 feet across at the base, and America wanted every single one of them turned into houses, ships, and railroad ties. But there was a problem the logging industry couldn't solve with axes and muscle. These forests grew on terrain that laughed at gravity. Slopes so steep a horse would tumble to its death, ravines that swallowed logging roads, hillsides where a man could barely stand, let alone drag a log that weighed more than 3 elephants. Ground logging had reached its limit. Horse teams were dying by the dozen. Operations were going bankrupt trying to reach timber that sat just a few hundred yards away but might as well have been on the moon. The industry needed a solution that defied physics itself. What they invented would hang logs in the sky on cables thin enough to snap your spine if they broke under tension. It would require men to climb living trees the height of a 20-story building with nothing but spikes and rope. And it would kill with such regularity that entire logging camps kept a running count of who'd make it to Christmas. But first, they had to figure out how to make a tree fly. Picture this. You're a logging foreman in 1915, standing at the top of a ridge in Washington's Cascade Mountains. Below you, stretching down a 60-degree slope into a ravine, stand the Douglas firs your company needs. Each tree is worth $500 in 1915 dollars, about $15,000 today. Your job is to get them to the mill 15 miles away. Your tools are axes, crosscut saws, horse teams, and a steam donkey engine that can pull logs along the ground. You try the obvious approach first, cut the trees, hitch them to horses, drag them uphill to the nearest road. The first attempt kills 2 horses when the log they're pulling breaks free and rolls backward, crushing them instantly. The veterinarian's bill, $200. That's $6,000 in modern money, and you haven't moved a single log to market. You try building a skid road, a pathway of logs laid perpendicular across the slope, greased with animal fat so timber can slide along it. It works for exactly 1 day. On the second day, a 40-foot log picks up speed on the greased skids, slips sideways, and takes out 3 men working below. 2 survive with broken bones, 1 doesn't. The logging operation shuts down for a week while the county investigates. Between 1910 and 1920, logging operations in Washington state reported over 1,400 deaths from accidents just like these. The fatality rate was 164 deaths per 100,000 workers, 23 times higher than the average for all industries. But the death toll was just part of the problem. The timber wasn't moving. Mills sat idle. Towns that depended on logging revenue were going broke, and every day the pressure mounted to find a solution. His name was Oscar Verkula. Finnish immigrant, born in 1880 in Kaustinen, Finland, arrived in Washington in 1898 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be done. Verkula worked as a logger in the Nacelle and Deep River area of Washington, watching men die trying to move timber across terrain that ground logging couldn't handle. And one day, staring up at the towering Douglas firs that surrounded his camp, he had an idea that seemed insane. What if you didn't drag the logs on the ground at all? What if you lifted them into the air and flew them across the ravines on cables? It wasn't completely new. Cable systems had been used in mining operations to move ore across canyons, but no one had figured out how to make it work in timber country, where the distances were longer, the weights were heavier, and there were no convenient cliff faces to anchor cables to. Verkula saw something everyone else had missed. The forest wasn't the problem. The forest was the solution. Those massive trees everyone was trying to cut down, use them as towers, rig cables from the top of one giant Douglas fir to anchor points hundreds of feet away, suspend the logs in midair, pull them across terrain that would kill a horse team. Around 1903, Verkula developed what would become known as Highlead logging. By 1917, he'd patented a 4-drum donkey engine specifically designed for his cable system. His choker hook, the device used to attach cables to logs, became so ubiquitous that it's still in use today, over a century later. But here's what Verkula couldn't have known. His invention was going to kill people. A lot of people. The timber industry loved Highlead logging because it solved the problem. You could reach timber on slopes so steep you'd break your neck trying to walk them. You could yard logs across ravines that were impossible to bridge. You could pull 10 logs at once instead of dragging them one at a time. By the 1920s, Highlead had become the dominant method for harvesting timber in the Pacific Northwest. Operations that had been losing money were suddenly profitable. Mills that had been starving for logs were running at capacity. Towns that had been dying were booming. But the safety statistics told a different story. Between 1920 and 1930, logging fatalities in Washington and Oregon increased by 40%. The Highlead systems that were making companies rich were also making widows at a rate that shocked even industry veterans who'd seen every kind of logging accident imaginable. The question wasn't whether men would die. The question was, how many would die before someone figured out how to make the system safer? And the answer to that question would take decades. Decades in which the cables would keep pulling timber across the sky, and the bodies would keep piling up at the base of spar trees. But to understand why Highlead logging was so dangerous, you first need to understand how the system actually worked. And that starts with the men who climbed trees that would give a structural engineer nightmares. The heart of every Highlead operation was the spar tree. This wasn't just any tree. This was a Douglas fir, preferably one that was 150 to 200 feet tall, arrow straight, and thick enough that 4 men holding hands couldn't circle it. In some operations, spar trees were topped at heights exceeding 200 feet. Finding the right spar tree was critical. It had to be strong enough to handle tensions that could reach 100,000 pounds or more. It had to be positioned correctly, ideally at the highest point of the logging site so gravity could help pull the logs in. And it had to be free of rot, cracks, or weak spots that might cause it to snap under load. Once the logging superintendent selected the spar tree, the high rigger went to work. The high rigger was a breed apart from other loggers. To do the job, you had to be comfortable climbing a living tree that was taller than a 20-story building. Carrying 50 pounds of rigging equipment, with nothing but climbing spurs strapped to your boots, and a wire cord rope called a climbing line looped around the tree trunk. The climb took 30 minutes for a 180-foot tree, longer if the tree was taller or if the high rigger had to stop to trim branches. The climber wore a wide leather belt with a rope attached. He'd flip the rope around the tree, lean back into the belt, lift one spiked foot, jam it into the bark, then repeat with the other foot, over and over, walking up the side of a tree while carrying an axe to trim branches as he climbed. At the predetermined height, usually where the trunk narrowed to about 3 to 4 feet in diameter, the high rigger would top the tree. This meant using a crosscut saw to cut through the trunk while standing on nothing but his spikes and belt. When the top section fell, the entire tree would shake violently. If the high rigger wasn't braced correctly, the motion could throw him off. More than one high rigger fell to his death when a tree top kicked sideways instead of falling cleanly. Once the tree was topped, the real work began. The high rigger had to install guy lines, heavy steel cables anchored to stumps or other trees in a circle around the spar. These guy lines kept the spar from being pulled over when logs were being yarded. Then came the blocks, massive pulleys weighing 200 to 500 pounds each that had to be hauled up the tree by rope and attached to the spar about 20 feet below the top. The largest block, called the head block, weighed close to 500 pounds and had to be positioned perfectly. This block would carry the main line and the haulback line, the cables that would do the actual work of pulling logs. Installing the head block required strength, precision, and nerves that most men didn't possess. You were 150 feet in the air, standing on metal spikes, trying to maneuver a half-ton piece of steel into position while the wind tried to knock you off balance, and every movement made the tree sway. With the spar tree rigged, the Highlead system could begin operation. The basic setup used two cables powered by a steam donkey engine, a coal-fired boiler mounted on a heavy steel frame connected to drums that could wind and unwind thousands of feet of steel cable. The main line, or yarding line, was typically 1 inch to 1.25 inches in diameter, thick enough that you couldn't wrap your hand around it. This cable ran from the donkey engine through the head block at the top of the spar tree and out into the logging area. At the far end, sometimes 1,000 feet away or more, was a tail block anchored to a stump or another tree. The haulback line was slightly smaller, maybe 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It also ran through the head block, but in the opposite direction, forming a loop that could pull the rigging back out after logs were yarded in. Where the two cables met, loggers attached the butt rigging, a heavy chain assembly with multiple attachment points. To this, they connected chokers, individual cables that wrapped around the logs to be pulled. Here's how a turn worked. Choker setters would trek out into the brush, sometimes 800 to 1,000 feet from the spar tree. They'd wrap chokers around the logs that had been cut and bucked to length. Using whistle signals, a language of short and long blasts that could be heard over the roar of the donkey engine, they'd tell the donkey puncher, the engineer operating the steam donkey, they were clear. The donkey puncher would engage the main line drum. The cable would tighten. The head block, 150 feet up the spar tree, would take the strain, and the logs would begin to move. In ground lead logging, the logs dragged along the forest floor, collecting dirt, rocks, and debris. But in Highlead, the spar tree lifted the front end of the logs off the ground. A log that weighed 50 tons on the ground might have 20 tons of that weight suspended in the air, with only the back end dragging. This made the system faster and more powerful. You could pull logs across terrain that would stop a horse team dead. You could yard logs across ravines, over brush piles, through areas where no road could be built. The sight of it was something that stopped you cold if you'd never seen it before. A tree trunk 2 feet across and 60 feet long, lifted into the air by a cable thin as your thumb, swinging across a canyon like a medieval battering ram. The head block at the top of the spar tree taking all that weight, creaking and groaning as the log pendulum swung through the forest. When the logs reached the landing, the flat area at the base of the spar tree, the donkey puncher would slack the main line, dropping the logs onto a pile called the cold deck. The choker setters would unhook the chokers, once the haulback line would pull the butt rigging back out, and the whole process would start again. A good crew could yard 40 to 50 logs a day. That translated to thousands of board feet of lumber. At peak efficiency, a Highlead operation could clear an acre of old-growth forest in a week. But efficiency came with a price written in blood. When a 1/4-inch cable breaks under 50,000 pounds of tension, it doesn't just fall. It whips. The stored energy in that cable releases like a bullet fired from a rifle. If you're in the path of that whipping cable, it will cut through you like you're not even there. Flesh, bone, it doesn't matter. You're dead before you hit the ground. Cable failures were the nightmare that haunted every Highlead operation. Cables could fail for a dozen reasons. Metal fatigue from being bent around blocks thousands of times, corrosion from exposure to rain and moisture, overloading beyond the safe working limit, or damage from being dragged across sharp rocks and logs. The warning signs were sometimes visible. Broken wire strands sticking out from the cable like steel whiskers called fish hooks by loggers. But other times, the failure was internal. The core of the cable would corrode while the outer strands looked fine. Then, under load, the cable would simply explode. Between 2006 and 2015, specialized logging and wood processing machinery, including cable systems, were involved in 56 recorded fatalities. But those are just the deaths that made it into official statistics. In the 1920s and 1930s, when Highlead logging was at its peak and safety regulations were practically non-existent, the real death toll was much higher. But cables weren't the only killer. The logs themselves became weapons. A 50-ton log suspended in the air has momentum that defies human comprehension. If something goes wrong, if a choker slips, if the donkey puncher loses control, if the load swings wrong, that log becomes an unstoppable battering ram. It will crush anything in its path, trees, equipment, Human beings. Logs being yarded would sometimes strike standing trees at the edge of the corridor. The impact would send widowmakers, dead branches, or chunks of bark falling from above. A 20-pound chunk of wood falling 150 feet hits with the force of a sledgehammer. And more than one choker setter was killed when a log he just hooked hit a tree and sent debris raining down. Then there was the spar tree itself. Guy lines kept the spar upright, but they had to be adjusted as the yarding direction changed. If the rigging crew miscalculated the load angle, or if a guy line broke, the spar could be pulled over. Imagine 200 feet of Douglas fir, weighing 30 to 40 tons, falling like a felled tree. Everything beneath it dies. The high rigger working on top dies. The ground crew below dies. The donkey puncher in the steam donkey often dies when the massive head block, no longer held up by the spar, crashes down onto the machinery. Spar tree failures were rare, but when they happened, they often killed everyone on site. And then there were the less spectacular but more common accidents. Choker setters worked in areas where logs had been cut and left lying across steep slopes. One wrong step and you'd fall into a gap between logs. If the logs shifted while you were trapped, they'd crush you. Donkey punchers worked next to steam boilers running at 150 to 200 psi. If a boiler exploded, which happened more often than companies wanted to admit, it didn't just pop, it detonated. The blast would send the boiler itself flying hundreds of feet. Anyone nearby would be vaporized by superheated steam or shredded by metal shrapnel. High riggers faced a different calculation. Every time you climbed a spar tree, you were betting your life that your equipment was sound, that the tree wouldn't rot from the inside out, and that you wouldn't slip, fall from 150 feet, and it doesn't matter if you land on soft ground or hard rock. The impact will kill you either way. The safety equipment was minimal. No harnesses with backup lines, no helmets, no cut-resistant clothing, just boots with spikes, a leather belt, and a rope. If your climbing line broke, or if your spikes pulled out of soft bark, you fell, and falling meant dying. One logger named Jack Morrison became legendary in logging camps for surviving 2 boiler explosions, losing 3 fingers to frostbite, and once steering a steam hauler across a frozen river while the ice cracked beneath him. He didn't panic, he just opened the throttle wide and raced the ice to solid ground. Stories like his circulated through camps because survival stories gave men something to hold on to. But for every Jack Morrison, there were a dozen men whose names appeared in the casualty reports and were forgotten. The logging industry's response to the death toll was pragmatic to the point of callousness. Dead men were replaced. Operations continued. The timber had to move. Who were these men willing to climb 180-foot trees and work beneath 50-ton logs suspended on cables thin enough to whip through a human body? Many were immigrants. Scandinavians, Finns, Swedes, Norwegians dominated the logging camps of Washington and Oregon. They'd grown up in countries where forestry was a way of life, where men learned to handle axes and saws before they learned to read. They came to America chasing wages that were unimaginable back home. A choker setter in 1925 might make $5 a day, about $90 in today's money. Dangerous, backbreaking work, but it was steady employment in an era when steady employment was rare. High riggers earned more, and sometimes $8 to $10 a day because the job required skill and nerve that most men didn't have. But the money came with a cost beyond the danger. Logging camps were isolated, often accessible only by foot or narrow-gauge railroad. You might work 6 days a week, 10-hour days, and not see a town for months at a time. You lived in bunkhouses, wooden structures that slept 20 to 30 men in rows of bunks stacked 2 or 3 high. The smell was a mixture of wet wool, tobacco smoke, sweat, and the accumulated human existence of men who worked themselves to exhaustion and rarely bathed. Food was served in a cookhouse, and the meals were designed for quantity over quality. Beans, potatoes, bread, salt pork, and coffee, strong enough to dissolve the enamel on your teeth. The cooks, usually a small crew of 2 or 3, would feed 50 to 100 men per shift. If you didn't like what was served, you didn't eat. Entertainment was minimal. No electricity meant no radios. Some camps had a phonograph with a handful of scratchy records that got played until everyone was sick of hearing them. Men played cards, carved wood, wrote letters home, or just sat in the bunkhouse and talked. The conversation inevitably turned to logging, stories of close calls, arguments about the best way to rig a spar tree, debates about which crew was the fastest. But mostly, men talked about who'd gotten hurt that day and who'd gotten killed. In a Highlead camp in the 1920s, death wasn't an abstraction. It was your bunkmate who fell off a spar tree Tuesday morning. When it was the new kid who got crushed by a rolling log his second day on the job. It was the donkey puncher who got scalded to death when a steam line burst. The camp kept a running tally, sometimes informal, sometimes posted on a board in the cookhouse. Days since last fatality. 12. When the number reset to 0, everyone knew the work would stop for maybe an hour while the body was hauled out. Then the spar tree would start yarding again because stopping meant losing money, and losing money meant the camp might shut down. Some men lasted years in the camps. Others lasted weeks before deciding the money wasn't worth the risk. There was no shame in walking away. Most loggers understood that high-lead work wasn't for everyone, but the men who stayed developed a fatalistic acceptance of the danger. I know you couldn't do the job while paralyzed by fear. You learned to watch for the signs that something was wrong, the sound of a cable starting to fray, the way a log might shift unpredictably under load, the subtle sag in a guy line that meant it needed tightening, and you learned which men you could trust. A good choker setter knew how to wrap a choker so it wouldn't slip. A good donkey puncher could feel through the controls when the load was starting to hang up. A good high rigger could climb faster and safer than any man in camp. Those men became crew bosses, their judgment trusted because they'd survived when others hadn't. In the brutal meritocracy of logging camps, competence was the only currency that mattered. A typical day in a Highlead logging operation started before dawn. The whistle blew at 5:30 a.m., unrousing men from their bunks for a breakfast of pancakes, bacon, and coffee. By 6 a.m., crews were walking or riding the narrow-gauge logging train to the worksite, sometimes miles from camp. The first task was firing up the donkey engine. This took 30 to 45 minutes, shoveling coal into the firebox, building up steam pressure, checking that all the drums and cables were functioning correctly. The donkey puncher and his assistant, called the leverman, would inspect the equipment, looking for any sign of damage or wear. Meanwhile, the high rigger and his crew would inspect the spar tree and its rigging. Guy lines needed daily checks. Tensioning them correctly was critical. Too loose, and the spar could be pulled over. Too tight, and you'd crack the tree or pull the anchors out of the ground. The choker setters would head out into the brush, carrying their chokers and the butt rigging. The brush was dense, salal, ferns, devil's club, with thorns that would go straight through leather gloves. Logs from previous turns created obstacles you had to climb over or crawl under, and always the ground was uneven, often at steep angles that made every step treacherous. Once on site, the choker setters would wrap their chokers around the logs to be yarded. A good choker setter could wrap and secure a log in under 2 minutes. The key was getting the choker positioned correctly. If it was too far back on the log, the front end would dig into the ground during yarding. Too far forward, and the log might roll when lifted. With all chokers set, the crew would retreat to safe positions, usually uphill and to the side of the yarding corridor. The man in charge of the setting was called the rigging slinger or hook tender, would blow a whistle pattern signaling the donkey puncher to engage the main line. The whistle codes were simple but critical. 1 long blast, stop everything. 2 short blasts, go ahead slow. 3 short blasts, go ahead fast. 4 short blasts, slack the line. Series of short blasts, emergency, shutdown. These whistles could be heard over the roar of the donkey engine, the screaming of cables under tension, and the crash of logs being pulled through the brush. If the whistle system broke down, the operation stopped because there was no other way to safely control the yarding. As the logs came in, the landing crew, usually 2 or 3 men, would work to unhook the chokers and deck the logs. This was dangerous work. A log that had just been yarded was still under tension from the cables. Slack the line too fast, and the log could roll. Logs stacked in the cold deck could shift if the pile wasn't stable. More than one landing man was crushed when a log rolled off the deck unexpectedly. A productive Highlead operation would yard 40 to 50 logs in a 10-hour shift, producing 40,000 to 60,000 board feet of timber. At 1925 prices of about $30 per thousand board feet, that translated to $1,200 to $1,800 worth of timber per day, roughly $22,000 to $33,000 in modern dollars. But here's something that separated Highlead logging from almost any other industrial operation of its time. The work required perfect coordination between men who often couldn't see each other and who were separated by distances of up to 1,000 feet. The choker setters in the brush had to trust that the donkey puncher would respond correctly to whistle signals. The donkey puncher had to trust that the choker setters knew what they were doing. The high rigger maintaining the spar tree had to trust that the ground crew wouldn't overload the system. One mistake could kill everyone, and mistakes happened every single day. By 1925, Highlead logging had become the dominant method for harvesting timber in the Pacific Northwest. The numbers tell a story of industrial might that's almost impossible to comprehend from a modern perspective. In 1920, Washington State produced 7.06 billion board feet of lumber, the peak year of production before the Great Depression. Oregon produced another 4 billion board feet. Together, these two states were producing enough lumber to build 700,000 houses per year. Highlead systems made this possible. Before Verkula's invention, loggers were limited to timber within a mile or two of water or railroad tracks, and even then, only on relatively flat ground. Highlead opened up steep terrain that had been considered unloggable. Suddenly, timber on 60-degree slopes, timber in ravines, timber on the sides of mountains, all of it became accessible. The economic impact rippled through entire communities. Towns like Aberdeen, Longview, and Everett in Washington grew from small lumber camps into thriving cities. The lumber industry employed 2/3 of Washington's wage earners by 1910. Every mill worker, every train engineer, and every merchant selling supplies to logging camps, all of them depended on the system of cables and spar trees pulling timber out of the mountains. But the environmental impact was staggering. The old-growth forests that had stood for centuries were being clear-cut at a pace that shocked even people who supported the logging industry. By 1950, most of the virgin timber in the coastal regions of Washington and Oregon was gone. What had taken 500 years to grow was cut down in 50. The companies that controlled the timber made fortunes. Weyerhaeuser, Simpson, Crown-Zellerbach, these names became synonymous with Pacific Northwest timber. They owned hundreds of thousands of acres of forest land and operated dozens of mills. The profits from timber-funded mansions in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. But here's the thing, the profit and loss statements didn't capture. Every log that moved on those cables represented a calculated risk that someone might die pulling it. And over the decades of Highlead logging's dominance, thousands did. By the late 1940s, Highlead logging's days were numbered. Not because it didn't work, it worked spectacularly well, but because technology was advancing, and newer methods promised the same productivity with less danger. The mobile steel spar tower, introduced in the 1950s, eliminated the need for high riggers to climb living trees. These towers were 100 to 120 feet tall, mounted on heavy vehicles, and could be moved from site to site in a matter of hours. No more rigging guy lines, no more worrying about whether the spar tree would hold, no more high riggers betting their lives on spikes and rope. Mechanized equipment was getting better. Crawler tractors with winches could yard logs on terrain that wasn't quite as steep as what Highlead handled. Truck logging, where logs were loaded directly onto trucks rather than yarded to a central landing, was becoming economically viable as roads improved. And there was another factor. The social cost of the deaths was becoming harder to ignore. By the 1950s, labor unions were strong enough to demand better safety conditions. Workers' compensation laws were forcing companies to pay for workplace injuries and deaths. The old attitude of men die, replace them, keep working wasn't acceptable anymore. The last commercial Highlead operation using a living spar tree likely shut down sometime in the 1960s or early 1970s. The exact date is hard to pin down because small operations in remote areas kept using the method long after the big timber companies had switched to newer systems. But the transition wasn't instantaneous. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, you could still find Highlead operations scattered across Washington and Oregon. The men who knew how to rig a spar tree and run the system were aging, and companies were training fewer new workers in the method. It was like watching a language die out. Each year, fewer people remembered how to speak it. If you know where to look, you can still find traces of Highlead logging in the Pacific Northwest forests. The most obvious artifacts are the springboard notches, horizontal cuts in old stumps where fallers would insert springboards to cut the trees above the flared base. These notches are distinctive enough that foresters can identify them decades later, but the spar tree stumps are even more telling. If you find a stump that's larger than the trees around it, positioned at the highest point of a logged area, with bolts or cable remnants still embedded in the wood, that was a spar tree. The bolts held the guy line anchors. The cable remnants are from the rigging that was abandoned when the operation moved to a new site. Some forests have entire graveyards of logging equipment, rusted donkey engines, cable drums, massive blocks and pulleys that were too heavy to move when operations shut down. The metal is corroded now, covered in moss, and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But the engineering is still impressive. These machines were built before CAD software, before modern metallurgy, and before electric motors were common. Everything was coal-fired steam, steel plate, and heavy iron castings. Museums preserve some of the history. The Apello Archives and Logging Museum in Nassau, Washington, has exhibits on Oscar Verkula and the development of Highlead logging. The Museum of History and Industry in Seattle has photos from the Darius Kinsey collection, thousands of images documenting Pacific Northwest logging in the early 1900s. Looking at those photos, you can see the scale of the operations. Trees so large that 8 men could stand on a single stump. Spar trees rigged with enough cable to hang a suspension bridge. But what the museums can't capture is the sound. The scream of cables under tension. The roar of the donkey engine. The crash of a 60-foot log hitting the cold deck at 20 miles per hour. The short whistle blast that meant slack the line. That's lost to history, remembered only in the accounts of old-timers who worked the camps. A few logging history enthusiasts have recreated small-scale Highlead demonstrations at logging shows. Watching one is eerie if you understand what you're seeing. The spar tree, even a small one, sways under load. The cables sing when they tighten. The logs lift off the ground with a lurch that makes your stomach drop. And you realize that men did this every day, for 10 hours a day, knowing that one mistake meant death. Highlead logging was the product of an era that believed the natural world existed to be conquered. The forests were resources to be extracted. The mountains were obstacles to overcome. And men were expendable if it meant moving timber to market. And we look back now and see the environmental destruction. Old-growth forests clear-cut, hillsides stripped bare, erosion choking salmon streams. We see the human cost, widows and orphans, men crippled by accidents, communities that boomed and then died when the timber ran out. But we also see something else, a level of skill, coordination, and sheer nerve that's almost unimaginable to modern sensibilities. These men were doing work that would terrify most people today, using technology that was barely removed from the Industrial Revolution, in conditions that would violate 100 different OSHA regulations. They weren't heroes, they were just working men doing dangerous work for wages. But the fact that they could make it work at all, that they could rig cables strong enough to lift 50 tons, that they could climb 180-foot trees, that they could coordinate the movement of massive logs across terrain that would kill you if you slipped. That speaks to a kind of practical competence that we've largely mechanized away. Modern logging is safer, much safer. Hydraulic machines do the dangerous work. GPS systems track timber. Computer-controlled cable yarders adjust tension automatically. Men rarely die in logging accidents anymore, at least not at the rates they did in the 1920s. But something was lost in that transition. Not the danger, good riddance to that, but the knowledge that certain kinds of difficult, dangerous work could be done with simple tools, human skill, and a willingness to accept risk that modern society wouldn't tolerate. The spar trees are gone now, cut down decades ago or rotted away to nothing. The cables rusted and were sold for scrap. The men who knew how to rig a Highlead system are dead or in their 90s. The whistle codes are forgotten. The camps are reclaimed by forest. But if you walk through the logged-over areas of Washington and Oregon, you're walking across ground where men once flew timber through the air on steel cables. And if you stop and look carefully at the stumps and the old anchor points, you can still see the ghosts of what they built. 50 tons, suspended in the air, pulled across a mile of wilderness by cables and muscle and sheer determination. It sounds impossible. It was impossible. But they did it anyway, because the timber had to move, and no one had invented a better way to move it. We've mechanized the forest now, automated the danger away, built machines that do in hours what used to take days. But there's a graveyard of men beneath those forests who never got to see the future, who climbed trees the height of skyscrapers with nothing but spikes and rope, who wrapped chokers around logs that could crush them if they slipped, who ran cables that could cut them in half if they broke. Their names are mostly lost, but the timber they pulled built the houses their grandchildren live in, built the ships that won wars, built the cities that grew up where there used to be nothing but forest. If you've got family stories from the logging camps, if you remember grandparents talking about the spar trees and the whistle codes and the men who didn't make it home, drop them in the comments. The machines are gone. The men are gone. But the stories are worth remembering. Every board in every house came from their labor, and sometimes it came at a cost we've chosen to forget.